The title of this talk is Walking Peacefully as Kateri walked forward. One of the things we're told in the scriptures is there's a famous verse. It says, young people see visions, old men dream dreams. And what the text is really doing is talking about the difference between age and youth. What you and I would call a dream, the Bible actually calls a vision. For them, when they say dream, they mean daydream. And it's always struck me that people who daydream, it's daydreaming about things of the past is actually a sign a person's old, that the daydream becomes more important than the past. And when you talk about people who envision and look at the future, and I've mentioned this before at talks, I think of my grandmother, who was always planning something and doing something. She lived to be 106, healthy, everything. She was young till the day she died. And she was young because she was a woman of vision. I think this is one of the major things we see in Kateri. She is a woman who decided to constantly look forward in her life, and she was never bound by the past. I'd like to talk about this a little in depth. First of all, she had good reason to think a lot about her past, and I'm thinking in terms of injustice. One of the ones is smallpox. We all know she got smallpox and was under the epidemic. But a lot of people died in the epidemic that went through. But Kateri did not die. But in a sense, worse. She lost a sibling, she lost her mother, she lost her father, and then was raised by her mother in another tribe. And in the other tribe, she arrived with her mother as a slave, and she had lived in this community that was really against her. Her closest relatives seemed to have been against her at one point, and that's largely because of her religion. The Mohawk, as you know, were not immediately sympathetic to Christianity, to the Catholic Church as it came in. And so she went through that tremendous amount of injustice. It wasn't her fault that the smallpox came. It wasn't her fault that she was brought into the faith by her mother. It wasn't her fault that she was in the situation she was. The other thing she bore throughout her whole life was the terrible problem with her eyes. Basically, the difficulty she suffered from is kind of like if you've ever been in a darkened movie theater and seen a movie, and when you step out of the building, you really can't see at all. It's just because everything's so bright. And that was what she suffered. Somehow, her eyes were amazingly susceptible to light, which is why when you look at actual drawings and things from the history of Kateri, you'll find her always wearing a veil. And the veil is set so that it comes out quite a ways over the front to keep her face in shadow away from the sunlight. I often wonder why. I have a large statue of Kateri at home, and I've seen about maybe 30 representations in statues. I've never seen one with her with a veil. I'm not sure why they don't do that. But anyway, she had this. So the thing to notice about her is she had real difficulties that came to her as injustices. They're not things she did or anything. They came to her, and she had to live with them. But she would not allow the injustices to anchor her or to hold her back. One of the things that we have to do as people is we have to know our past. As Native people, our past is really a difficult thing to deal with. I had to prepare a talk for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles last year, and the talk was to all the priests, bishops, and religious in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And the purpose of the talk was to talk about the history of the Native Americans, particularly in the Archdiocesan territory, and what happened with regards to the missions. And when I began to look at it, I heard a lot of stories about horrible things that happened to them in the mission system. But when I began to study it, and study it very carefully, I found out that the mission system, the evil that the mission system brought on, was unintentional, which was the disease they brought in. And if Native Americans were baptized, they were under the protection of the missions. And if they were not baptized, they could be hunted and killed by like animals. In fact, I had a friend of mine who, as a very elderly man, I met him in San Luis in the 1970s, and he had been sent by the federal government as the first surveyor of the Channel Islands off the coast of California. And when he went out there to survey them, he said there wasn't a single island he was on where there wasn't at least one pyramid of human skulls. And they were for people who went to the island and hunted Native Americans like they were animals, cut off their heads and put them there as kind of trophies. So there's a terrible, terrible background. That took place, incidentally, at the end of the mission period, before California was a state, before we had the American laws, but the end of the Spanish laws in that period there. We had our independence from Mexico before we got united to the United States, and that period right there was very, very dangerous to Native Americans. They were killed and all this sort of thing. So we need to know exactly what happened. If we are not cognizant of what happened, we're always in danger of seeing it evolve again. But we cannot let a difficult past hold us back. To look at I've mentioned her many times, my own grandmother. My grandmother was taken away from her family when she was a little tiny girl and spent about 8 years in a school that the government put up in Canada. She was forbidden to practice the Catholic faith. She had to practice the Anglican faith in the school. She was forbidden to speak Algonquin or French, as the community was speaking at the time, and she had to dress in Western clothes. It was a horrible experience, and she never saw her parents for the 8 years. When she talked about it, she would explain it. She explained it as a terrible time and how but did it hold her back? No. Did it depress her? In fact, I've told you before, when I asked her about it, I said, "How do you feel about it?" She says, "I feel fine. I'm here. They're all dead." Had this great sense that it didn't hold her back and didn't affect her. Gadeli was exactly the same way. She was knowledgeable of what happened. She understood the injustices, and the injustices did not affect her. To the degree we allow these to affect us, we do not thrive as a people. As a people, we end up held together by depression and problems like that. And to that degree, there was no reason for us to survive. When I look back at all my ancestors, and I look back at all they went through that brought me to where I am, I have a duty to have a happy, successful life, because that makes what they did valuable. And if that doesn't happen, if we don't create that life for ourselves, they might as well have died in vain. Another thing I'd like, and I just put this kind of a side thing, we all know very well about Gadeli's devotion to the cross. In fact, every statue or representation I've ever seen of her, she's holding a cross. And the cross was very, very important to her. It became very important to Native Americans all over. In fact, if you go to areas in Canada today, you can find the cross carved in trees that was carved a long, long time ago by Native Americans as a symbol of the faith growing. And so the cross became very, very important as a symbol. However, one of the things about the cross, when you study in Catholic theology, there are two people who are most famous with regards to this. One is called John of the Cross, Another man's called Paul of the Cross. Another person who'd be really good on this, incidentally, is Teresa of Avila. But they had a great and powerful devotion to the cross because these three people suffered terrible injustices in their life. And somehow they were able to focus the injustices and the things that they suffered, they focused it into the cross itself. And what's interesting about it, the cross, of course, for us as Christians, is the symbol of the ultimate injustice to Jesus. But you watch Jesus go through it. It's interesting when Jesus is in this terrible situation at all, if he encounters someone of sincerity, it's as though everything's fine. I think of when Pilate said, "What's truth?" Jesus was speaking to him. Jesus went into a conversation with Pilate. He said nothing to Herod. In the scriptures, he has no conversation with Herod at all, no matter what Herod says. It's because Herod was malicious. So just let it go. Remember when Jesus is on the cross, turns to the good thief. The good thief mentions that, remember me when you get into paradise? Whether the good thief knew much about him or was just trying to be nice to someone he saw he was having troubles, Jesus' response was immediate. This day you'll be with me in paradise. We have to be knowledgeable of the injustice, but we cannot let the injustice form the way we speak and the way we act, much less the way we feel. To the degree it forms those things are negative to us. And we don't need to do that at all. Another thing that's very important about Kateri, and we always need to remember this, is her Native American culture. It's curious today, when you look in the Catholic Church, what's going on, most particularly under Pope Francis, with the idea of the approach to nature and the care of nature and renewing the world and the purity of water and all this stuff. When you look at all these things today, you realize that what is most necessary for American culture is the Native American voice. We, in fact, are the people who have the heritage, the background, and the consensus of how to deal with and be proper to nature. We have acquired wisdom over the years through our dealing with nature. Our dealing with nature, it has become like a religion. I think it is impossible to separate Native American religion from Native American approach to nature. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. I'd like to talk now about religion. One of the things that is really interesting in Native American culture is that we expect that every person is a person of prayer. And in the Native community, it is presumed that every person is a person of prayer and listens individually to the divine. Kateri was one who did that you're supposed to listen individually to the divine. It's interesting, in the Roman Catholic tradition, we tend historically to see God speaking through the church. But understand that the church is a collection of individuals. And what the church is supposed to do is speak God's word as God's word has been spoken to all the individuals. That is what is collectively the word of God within the church. And one of the things that was said, one of the great explorers, might have been connected to Lewis and Clark, but one of the greatest explorers who came across the United States and was individually dealing with the tribes. Incidentally, the gentleman I'm thinking of left a historical record with regards to portraits of the different tribes as well. So when he was finishing, he said, and I'd like to quote just exactly what he said. He said, "For Native Americans, prayer was universally practiced among all the natives and seemed for them the first necessity of life." Okay? So he said that Native Americans saw prayer, this communication with God, as the first necessity of life. And the reason he went on to explain is prayer is almost like the, what do you want to call it? The book of instructions on how to run a life. So if you don't have prayer, you don't know how to live life. In this prayer relationship to God, where he speaks to individuals, he speaks to each one of us in the silence of our hearts or however we choose to pray. That is where you and I find direction from God. That one of the things that's true about Native Americans, in fact, one of the things I most like about Native Americans is the fact that people are so different. So that, like, if you were to go to a Navajo gathering, you can tell what a Navajo regalia is, but you won't see any two the same. You can tell Assiniboine regalia. You can tell Cheyenne regalia, Mohawk regalia. You can tell the regalia, and you recognize it immediately, and at the same time, no two are the same. We have a great ability in our tribes. I would like to see us see it more universally, but we have a great ability in our tribes to be individuals and still a tribe. And that comes from this individual listening to God. We believe that's what makes the church as well, as I said, that we are a collection who individually listen to God. And again, God isn't going to speak differently to different people. Doesn't say one thing to one person, to another thing to another person. He says one thing, but he says it in different ways to different individuals. And we recognize that in the Native community. That's a part of the way we're structured and a part of the way we carry on. We are taught to be people who really, really care for and are involved with the animals that we eat, the animals that are part of us. When I think of the buffalo, it's the Assiniboine lived largely off the buffalo. And living off the buffalo, we treated the buffalo with great reverence and devotion. Buffalo skulls were very much a part of our prayers. Buffalo hides were used as both clothing and carpet areas where we would worship. Most particularly, the hide of the white buffalo was seen as very, very sacred, and the community would gather and this sort of thing. But that didn't preclude the fact that we were killing buffalo and eating them. But the buffalo that we killed, we always considered were a gift to us from the herd. It's as though as the herd went through, it's the herd that selected the ones that we were to kill. And when we killed them cleanly, killed them as best we could. We used all parts of them. You made sure no animal was injured. And we had a great devotion to the buffalo, great prayers to the buffalo. The buffalo, in many ways, was considered part of the family. And I think it's interesting that in the buffalo hunts, periodically you'd end up with a baby buffalo because the mother was killed in the hunt or something, and after the herd went on, the baby would be standing there. But you know, Native Americans took care of those animals and raised them. They were raised almost like pets, but they would keep them and raise them in the tribal gatherings. And so one of the things we have is a great devotion to nature. And it's why we treat these things in a set way. We see the buffalo as a creature of God, created by God, all this sort of thing. But we're also creatures of God, created by God. And we have this somehow a relationship with the buffalo. When I was in Japan last year for a month, studying a little bit about Zen Buddhism. But when I was in Japan, one of the things that we had dinners, we had very nice dinners. A friend of mine and I went, and we ate alone in our own little dining room because we both spoke English. In the area we were in, almost no one spoke English. So we would eat alone at this table. It was interesting, the very first day when we went into dinner, they brought dinner. The dinners were massive and largely seafood, but one of the things they brought in was an abalone. And we each got one, the large abalone. They set it upside down on a brazier. and put butter on it. And as it was cooking, it started to move, and I realized it was alive. And so I told my friend, I said, in our tradition, we don't torture animals. I said, you aren't going to cook it alive at the table. So he said to me, well, we don't have to eat it. I said, we don't eat it. It died in vain. So I said, this one having been cooked, I said, we will eat the abalone. But I said, we'll also let the cook and everything know nothing is to be brought to the table alive and cooked in front of us. That's not to be done. And it has to do with the way you deal with nature. We don't deal with the nature by saying you can't eat the buffalo, or you can't eat the abalone, or you can't eat this, or you can't eat the other. We don't deal with it that way. But we do say that you must respect it and honor it and build it. And I don't know if this is true from native culture or whatever, but I'll tell you, in my own family, I was never allowed to eat anything that I had not at least seen how it was killed. And to give you an example, I did not have to see the steer killed that would serve us a steak, but I never ate beef until after I had seen a steer killed. I never ate pork until after I had seen a pig killed. I was never allowed to eat chicken until after I'd seen a chicken killed. Because you have to understand that is a life. You have to understand the relationship to nature. People really understand about when Columbus arrived. But when Columbus arrived, did you know that there were more people in North and South America? There were more Native Americans than there were all the people in Europe at the time. Not only that, the people in North America had game everywhere. In California, where I live, the Native Americans on the coast here lived on elk that were everywhere, and largely seafood, abalone and stuff like that. You can almost never find abalone of any size out here anymore, and elk are totally gone. They've disappeared from the area completely. When the Europeans came over, there were no trees in Europe. That's one of the big things. When we talk about gold and stuff that was taken from the New World to Europe, the most valuable thing Europe received, and they received tons and tons and tons of it, was wood. They had decimated their trees. But in Europe, they had decimated and destroyed nature because they had no idea how to deal with it. Even though there were more people over here, their water was polluted, not ours. Their rivers were undrinkable, not ours. They were poisoning themselves in their cities by the water that was being pumped to them, not us. It has to do with understanding that there is a set way of dealing with nature. For us, nature was primarily a messenger as nature. I'll give you an example. In the Assiniboine in Canada, one of the big events of the year was the first time we would see a wild goose come. The Canadian geese come north for the summer. And as soon as you would see a wild goose coming, you knew that the winter was over. I think you know the end of winter, beginning of fall. It's hard to tell whether it's winter or fall. But when you saw the Canada goose, winter was over and summer was coming. It was a huge celebration in the tribe. And one of the reasons is almost everyone died of the flu in winter. Everyone would die of the flu in winter. So if you came to the wild goose coming up, it indicated to you you were 1 year older. We used to count our age in winters. How many winters have you survived? If you got through this one, you're good for another year. And then the next winter would be the time when people would die. And so the wild goose was a sign of the summer, and different animals became different signs to us. But nature was very much alive and a part of our world. And I don't think I have to remind you that you don't need to be a genius to look at the world today and know that Mother Nature is very, very angry. And Native Americans, and I don't just mean Native Americans, because I've been with the Maori in New Zealand and the Aborigine in Australia. Native peoples throughout the world know how to deal with nature in their own land. And we have to, as a society, learn to listen to Native peoples. They have learned how to deal with the land over centuries. And it doesn't help to bring in the rules for Europe and apply them here. You have to understand the wisdom of the Native Americans. Another thing that Godley is an example of is this whole business of the preservation of each individual while being together. I'll tell you that largely because of my training in Western schools, this is far and away the most difficult part of me to Native American gatherings. When we go to a Native American gathering, we expect each person to give an opinion and to be listened to. And over and over and over we go through this. And we exhaust. We actually make many people speak. And we exhaust things as we try and come to ideas. But that bothers me because of my experience. But I will tell you there's a verse in the Bible. And the verse in the Bible says, good decisions come from many counselors. And in our communities, people have a right to speak. And we hear all these different things and bring them together in order to make, our decision. I think of it in terms of dancing. When we gather, you'll see a circle, and our people are moving in a circle to the drums. And as you watch people, you'll see people who are walking. You'll see people going through a fancy dance. You see all different kinds of things as people are moving in the circle. What we're doing together is moving in the circle. What we're doing individually can be all kinds of things, again, from walking to the fancy dance. That's the way we want to be as a community. As a community, we want to be people each doing what we hear God calling us to do, and each doing it with freedom and excitement. And while we're doing that, the whole group is moving forward as a group as we go on. We're called today to look at Godley as an example of the future. A big part of her example for us is her Native American background, her attitude to nature, her attitude to religion, her attitude to prayer did not come from the Christian faith. It came from her Native American culture. And that's what we need to look at her, is what she brings from the Native culture to the church. We are called the Catholic Church for a reason. The word Catholic means universal. And as a community, we move through history, and as different groups come in, we learn from them. The biggest thing that the community can learn from us is this idea of the relationship with nature and coming to peace with the world in which we live before we destroy the world in which we live. The example for all of that is Godley, Native American, Catholic, moving forward, not encumbered by the problems of her past. May she be an example for all of us.